Convene our meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission with the City Council Ordinance Committee. Hope everybody had a great holiday season. Happy New Year. It's hard to believe it's fading in the distance already. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Are there any changes to it? All right, seeing none, we'll stick with our agenda as we have. Item 2 is a public forum, and we're having 2 different public forums today. This is the first one that's for items that are not on the agenda. And at our last meeting, you'll recall, we had a substantial public forum where we heard from the public on the short-term rentals. And our goal, as we said at the end of the last meeting, was this meeting then would focus on the commission's work on that. And then after we do our work, we'd go back to hear from the public again so they could weigh in on what we were talking about. But we heard from them pretty substantially at the last meeting. So this public forum is one for anyone who'd like to address the commission on items that are not on the agenda. Is there anyone, Megan, who wants to speak on that?
Yes, Andy. So we do have one person. Rosaire Long is here from the Elks Club. Rosaire, we should be able to hear you.
Am I coming through now?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Oh, okay. You want me to begin?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay. I did it as a written minute-and-a-half statement, so it would be concise for you. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Rosaire Lange, a trustee, along with Dave Hartnett, with the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks, which refers to the Elks Lodge at 925 North Avenue. The Board of Directors have unanimously voted to request that the city grant moving the RCO line dividing our property westward approximately 338 feet to an extension southward of the boundary line separating numbers 65 and 75 Killarney Drive. Our talks with the Park Foundation were halted when the line of transfer discussed on the survey would leave the Elks maxed out for lot coverage, given the size of our building and parking lot. A new line was drawn to the further line of 65 Killarney, so we could have some ability in the future to do a small addition, such as a cooler, freezer, addition to our parking shelter, etc. The results would be approximately 5.3 acres that would remain for the residential low density that our building and parking and picnic area, etc., resides on and some lawn space, while leaving approximately 13 acres of RCO land that is wooded with trails and a large open space near the bike path. That adjoins city parkland and other Arms Forest project land all the way to the lake. With the zoning line adjustment, we could continue the process to finalize an agreement to transfer the 13 acres to join the Arms Forest project. And Dave Hartnett was supposed to be on with me, so he might add anything if he thought so. I don't see him on the screen. So I think I've covered it. So I thank you, commissioners, for your time and consideration to this request. I can answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. It sounds like you, as you said, you were reading from something. If you want to provide that to Megan or David, and they could circulate it to us as well.
Yeah, I'll email it to her tonight.
Great.
And you do have another written communication that Rosaire provided that's in your agenda packet. And there's some other additional materials that he has shared with the city staff in advance of tonight's meeting.
Great, thank you. And Megan, is there anybody else who wants to speak to us during this public forum?
If there's anybody else that would like to speak, I don't know of anyone ahead of time, but you can use the raise hand feature or drop your name really quickly into the chat and I can enable your microphone. Andy, I did want to just note that Cindy White, the Parks Director, is on too, just to listen to Rosaire's request to the Planning Commission. We've talked together and the Parks Department has previously worked with the Elks on some of the details that Rosaire shared with you tonight. So if the commission is willing to entertain the request to look at that zoning boundary line, we can bring back more information about the property and the boundary and some of the history of the discussions for the Planning Commission at a future meeting.
Yeah, I think that would be great, Megan. I know this has been an important project for a long time, and I think it's important to try to help keep moving this forward.
Okay, great.
So unless anybody is objecting to it, why don't you go ahead and do that, Megan?
Okay.
Doesn't look like I see any concerns about just bringing more information to us on this issue.
Sounds great. So Rosaire, I will follow up with you to talk about when we will bring this back to the committee and any other information we need from you.
Very good. And I'll send this as an attachment to you tonight. And if there's nothing further, may I be dismissed and log off?
Yes, certainly. And thanks
Thank you
again for
very
coming
much.
tonight.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. Okay, and
And
I'm
was there
not,
anybody else? Megan?
no, I'm not seeing anything else, Andy.
Okay, so we'll close the public forum and move on to item 3, which is proposed CDO amendment, short-term rentals. And again, this is primarily a working session for the commission and council. As I said just before, we got a fairly lengthy presentation at our last meeting in early December from staff, and then we heard extensive comments from the public as well. And we closed that meeting knowing that the next place for us to go was for us to do our work on it. Before we get going, Megan, are there any updates from you or from Scott before we start jumping into it?
Yeah, so one quick update that's a little bit of a housekeeping update, and then Scott has an update for you as well. Before the meeting tonight, probably about an hour and a half ago, I sent you all an email that included a number of additional communications that we received over the last 24 hours, as well as an additional communication from staff about a proposal that we would like to share with you as you start your discussion about kind of where the short-term rental regulations could live within city ordinances. And that part Scott was going to share with you.
So I think that would be really good for us to hear this to get started, because I think it could help us as we move forward quite a bit. So Scott?
Yeah, sure. So Happy New Year, everyone. So Megan and I resolved that one way or the other, we'll wrap up short-term rentals in 2021. We have what we think, David likes that. We have what we think is a slimmed down, more nimble, more responsive way to get where we have been talking about getting. So this is about shifting much of the zoning proposal into Chapter 18. So the policy points remain intact. There's still a few items to resolve, but by and large, the policy points remain intact. We're just talking about shifting this from one box into another. And so I'll go through some of the key points that are shown in this memo that Megan had sent earlier today. So in making this shift, we continue to prevent the wholesale conversion of dwelling units to STR use. We continue to enable residents to afford their homes and supplement their incomes. We continue to recognize that some supply of STRs is good for the Burlington economy. We continue to have a mechanism for these to contribute to affordable housing and the Housing Trust Fund, and we continue to ensure life safety standards for occupants. The committee still needs to decide whether and under what scenarios offsite hosting is acceptable. Currently, it's acceptable for multifamily properties, but that needs to be nailed down. So by moving to Chapter 18 of the city's Code of Ordinance, we preserve the per property limits on short-term rentals. So we don't have the entire apartment building ever converting to STRs. We preserve the nightly option, or the nightly fee option. We preserve life safety standards. We preserve the annual rental registration requirement. It also avoids the need for a zoning permit every time one of these switches between short-term and long-term rental use. It also avoids the need to tie the life of the zoning permit to continued annual rental registrations. It's a lot less bureaucracy in that respect. And it also avoids grandfathering of zoning permits issued under permanent, temporary, or interim zoning. So the limited rule that remains for zoning, we need to address short-term rentals in the use table and note that they're allowed everywhere residential use is allowed. They can be a use by right without a zoning permit requirement. We still need a definition and reference in Article 5 to Chapter 18. And we still need to make some cleanup of the lodging definition. So again, the policy proposal remains largely intact, but by shifting most of it to Chapter 18, we think this has a lot more flexibility and it avoids the baggage and grandfathering and other implications that come along with zoning. And that's the quick summary, Andy.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone have any questions for Scott? Okay, so if I understand Megan and Scott and Megan, the way this would work is what you're proposing or what you're suggesting as an option is that the zoning portion of short-term rentals be trimmed down. So it essentially would say in our use table and in the zoning provisions that short-term rentals are allowed, but it's governed by Chapter 18. And then Chapter 18 gives the nuts and bolts of how short-term rentals are implemented.
Yes.
And so what that would, and you talk about the grandfathering issue. By that, do you mean that if the rules change under Chapter 18 rules change, that those rules then follow the short-term rentals have to follow the new rules, whatever the new rules might be, much like the minimum housing code, as opposed to being grandfathered under the zoning rules if we specified it in zoning.
Right. Under Chapter 18, there's an annual rental registration requirement. And unlike a zoning permit, which you're vested in from now until you make a change, Chapter 18 is renewed every year. And if the rules change one way or the other, the new registration needs to deal with that. Emily had expressed concern about the implications of issuing zoning permits under an interim or even sunset provision in the zoning code, ending up with grandfathered status. That problem goes away by shifting over to Chapter 18.
So I'll just say, to me, I know since we've been having our discussions on short-term rentals, that one of the concerns has been if we go too far or too little, the concern about the grandfathering. And this seems to deal a lot with that, because what it seems to me that this will do for us is it lets us, through zoning, establish the baselines for what a short-term rental is. But the city ordinances allow it to be nimble over how to actually implement it within the city. So I think there's a possibility here that might work, but it's, where are other folks on that? Is it something people want to think about, consider, or do you want to just go to our proposed zoning code that we have?
I don't think I quite understand it.
Okay.
I'm not going to take a stab at explaining it, or maybe I'll relay my understanding. So one of the concerns I think all along has been or at least I have an uncertainty of, to Andy's point, if we went too far. We don't really know with changes. I mean, there's this fear that all of these people, or units will convert from long-term housing to short-term housing. And the concern has been, if we mess that up, we allow too many per, triplex or multi-unit, that under zoning, anyone who did it prior to the date we realized, oops, this was too far, is grandfathered and you can't pull that back. My understanding of moving it to minimum housing is, rather than be vested, in essence, running with a land, as a property lawyer would explain it, This is a short-term, 1-year authorization for that current use that could be changed by a subsequent council and mayor, respecting there will be pushback and there may need to be grace periods, if there are changes, but at least it's not indelible and can never be reversed. I know, given the uncertainty that I think we all have with this rollout, none of us really, we're looking at other jurisdictions trying to figure out what's the magic sauce, but Burlington is different and we all know that. This provides me a little more comfort that, even if we go too far, it's not forever and there's an opportunity to revisit that based on what happens on the ground. So I am, that's a long-winded way of saying I am supportive of exploring this because to me it provides greater flexibility as we move forward and figure out, once we pass policies, how they work actually on the ground.
Andy, if I might, I think all of the policy questions that you've been discussing are really the same. It's simply a matter of where in the city's code of ordinances does this live. I think wholesale, all of this can move to chapter 18, and it eliminates that concern about getting something wrong or missing something or wanting to change something in the future, and though anything that's been permitted is grandfathered. It becomes a much more flexible process from how we change the regulations going forward as we begin to understand how things work and how the market evolves. But it also should be a lot more straightforward to a host to understand that I'm going in, I'm getting this one thing, I'm getting this one piece of paper from DPI that is allowing me to do this, and I do that every year. It's an annual process.
And the only thing I would just add to that is that we know that there are some remaining policy questions that the committee was wrestling with, and we aren't introducing this as a way to shortchange those discussions, because we know that a lot of them, especially the issue of whether host has to live on site, those types of things are still really important issues for you to determine how you want to start this. But we also understood that some of the decision-making points around those policy questions were getting stuck in kind of an unsatisfactory process that wouldn't allow for flexibility in the future. And we're also contingent upon this discussion of fees that we also know is something that's outside of zoning. So we're not introducing this to say, end the conversation here. We think there are still some questions for you all to work through tonight. So.
Thanks. See, a lot of people are raising their hands, so I'm just going to start calling. Jack.
Thanks. Sorry, there's some background noise. No, thanks for all that context. So yeah, that seems to make sense then. Are there any downsides that staff sees or drawbacks to this shift?
It really seems to be, I'll go out on a limb, it really seems to be all positive. It allows us to be a lot more flexible and avoid some of the pitfalls that we were getting tied up with, especially with the vested rights that come with zoning permits if the rules change down the line.
Great. Well, thanks for figuring that out.
Thanks, Jack.
I have to admit, it wasn't easy for me to wrap my head around forgetting zoning when we first started talking about this as a staff.
I agreed, and I think that we all kind of struggled with this when Scott first mentioned it, but once you kind of come to realize that it's the same thing just in a different place, it's actually pretty genius.
Jennifer?
So yeah, I appreciate the off-the-cuff explanation from Councilor Mason. That really helped a lot. I think it's a good idea because one of the concerns I did have was it seemed important that we get this right if it was in zoning, and there's so many unknowns. I think of how this is going to actually have an impact. I feel a lot better that there's some flexibility sort of if you move this for us to make adjustments in the future without having to deal with the issue of grandfathering. So I think I really appreciate the out of the box thinking on this, and it appears based on what I've heard tonight like a good thing to look into and possibly adopt.
Alex?
I appreciate the explanation, Chip and Scott, but I have to say I have some residual skepticism. Like there has to be some downside, some unforeseen. I mean, that's always the risk with planning, is the unforeseen consequences. So, can you address those at all, or is this really just perfect?
Well, the zoning will still articulate, at least generally, where they're allowed. But the nuts and bolts would be in 18. The downside, I suppose the downside is, as an STR operator, you won't have that vested right forever once you get your zoning permit. Right?
Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but you would, if you, under zoning, once it's established as a like a short-term rental, you're allowed to continue that. But the manner in which you continue it, the rules under which you're continuing it, that's what could change under the minimum housing code. Is that a fair way of saying it? Or do I have that wrong?
Well, the rules could change under zoning too. But the thing is, if the rules change under zoning, they don't affect you if you have a zoning permit. Whereas
Right.
under 18, it's just a short-term annual rental registration. So adjustments could be made year by year.
So Andy, I think your point is also related to like detail about the permitting process and how the zoning and chapter 18 would work together. So what Scott and what staff have kind of envisioned for this is that we would have a section of our zoning ordinance that would say short-term rentals are allowed by right subject to the provisions of chapter 18, and that would be about it. And it would potentially also be a type of zoning situation where you wouldn't need to get a zoning permit at all. So that's why it's different than if they were fully regulated under zoning.
Got it. Thanks for the clarification. Sorry to interrupt the people who are talking. I think, Bruce, you're next on my list.
So I like some of the aspects of it. I mean, I do like the fact that one thing I had that was a little uncomfortable was the fact that if units are built as housing and then we switch them to STRs by zoning permit status, and then the zoning would change, let's say in an RL zone, they couldn't easily go back to housing units. They may not meet parking requirements or whatever. So I think that helps to solve that problem. But I'm putting myself in the shoes of an owner. Let's assume that under the rubric we create, it's an allowed use and they have a zoning permit as an STR, and then it's regulated under Title 18. Would they be allowed to continue that STR under those regulations, or could those regulations completely disable it?
Under chapter 18?
Right. In other words, I'm an owner, I have a zoning permit, I have a triplex, and I have one unit that's an SDR, I register it as an SDR. It's an allowed use under whatever we do here. We have a zoning permit for it. Under chapter 18, can that be taken away? I understand it can be regulated, but can that be taken away?
I think how it depends how we craft this, right? If we go without a zoning permit being involved at all, which I think makes sense under this scenario. Yeah, and it could be taken away, right? There would be no vested rights under 18. I think we'd be in an odd situation where we say, well, this is all under 18, except you need a zoning permit anyhow. I'm not quite sure how that would work. I think that would defeat the purpose in large part.
Just to follow up, but the CDO says that any development or any use requires a zoning permit. So how do you get over that?
Back to what Megan had said earlier, I mean, we could articulate these as a use by right. We do have an example. One that I can think of offhand is family daycares, right? It's a use by right. You don't need a zoning permit for it, but we do specify where they're allowed.
And we have a number of other exceptions in our ordinance for when a zoning permit isn't required.
If I could just add just to your comment, Bruce, and then I'll continue going. One of the things about the short-term rentals that has struck me from the very beginning is short-term rentals are just regular housing units that are being rented for a shorter period of time. So whether it's done, whether you're renting for one night, for 5 nights, for 30 nights, for a year, it's really the same unit. You may package it differently, but it's still just a housing unit. And so the housing unit doesn't go away. Just how much time that you'd be allowed to rent it may vary depending on what the regulations are. At least that's the way I'm looking at this. So let me just continue with people. Who else was wanting to speak? Zariah?
Yeah, also want to say thanks for kind of this fix. And then I guess my question is more around our long-term intentions. And I think for me, a big thing has been that, I guess for me, I would prefer not seeing a ban of most short-term rentals, but rather seeing some kind of like monetary compensation that really does start to replace that housing replacement fee, which I think we all agree we don't want to use the housing replacement fee as is. And so I guess my question is like in the long term, I know that I'm looking for like a charter change to give us more authority to use taxation as a like policy lever to encourage and discourage this, and to fund other types of housing in the city through the Housing Trust Fund. And so I guess my question is, what is our I guess with doing this for a year, is our long-term goal still to switch this to zoning, and how that plays in with us doing something like a charter change?
So if you do decide that you would like to move the bulk of the regulations around short-term rentals into Chapter 18, the regulations themselves wouldn't be effective for just 1 year. The 1 year applies to the effectiveness of the individual permits that people receive to operate short-term rentals. So in that case, making changes to Chapter 18 is, it's just like making a change to a zoning ordinance. The, council and its ordinance committee could consider making subsequent changes to Chapter 18 at any interval in the future that it might want to. I think that, there's nothing about this kind of regulatory vehicle change that we're talking about that would prevent you from pursuing a charter change related to fees. Any new fee that the city presumably enacted for short-term rentals would take effect whenever that charter change is effective, whether short-term rentals had previously been permitted or not. Similarly, any changes that you would make to the short-term rental regulations under Chapter 18 would take effect anytime that annual permit renews. So those changes could go into effect at the time they're changed, rather than like a zoning ordinance being effective at the time the application is made, and then any subsequent changes don't impact that permit.
Great, thanks. That's helpful, Megan.
Okay. Before I go back to Jennifer, is there anybody else who hasn't spoken yet? Okay, Jennifer.
I guess my only other question, because I think this is promising, is what's the enforcement that comes with Chapter 18? So who's responsible? What are your remedies if somebody's not following the rules?
Bill?
Well, we fortunately have Patty Wayman and Bill Ward from DPI who can help answer those questions.
I'm going to give Patty the nod to talk about what we do with rental housing because it's her division. But I would also point out that one of the nice things about this, if there are questions between the zoning or the Chapter 18 issues about these units being brought into compliance, Patty and Scott have offices right next to each other. So the beauty of DPI is that we have the ability to better organize this as a single entity. So Patty manages the housing division. I'll let her speak to those remedies and stand by if there are other questions.
Hi all. So we already have a rental registration process in place. I don't know that you're all looking to, or that we're looking to replicate it exactly. And I think that the details need to be worked out for this particular plan. However, The registration and the inspection process is very clear in Chapter 18, how we go through the process. When there are deficiency, I mean, it's very simplistically almost. Somebody registers with us, we make an appointment to inspect for basic life safety. We issue an order and a report listing the deficiencies that we find, and the property owner or manager will come into compliance with the order and the report. Theoretically, within 30 days or thereabouts. There are a lot of, I don't want to say exceptions, but, and I'm really sorry about the background noise, I can't control it. Every situation is just a little bit different. I mean, we have EMP compliance and smoke CO detection compliance, and what's the third one, Bill? I'm drawing a blank right now. Smoke CO, EMP, and the heating system, city heat tags and all heating systems. And so those are the big things. And to me, I personally like this idea, because I've always thought that we open ourselves up as a city. If we know that renting's going on, but they're not being inspected in the same way that our long-term rentals are being inspected, we are opening kind of a can of ugliness. And in this case, we're just calling a rental, short-term and long-term. As far as, again, going through the inspection process, if a property owner or manager doesn't agree with an order, there's due process by way of the Housing Board of Review that they can appeal any order to. I'm trying to think, and that's as binding in theory as going to court. I'm trying to think, and if I'm thinking specifically Airbnb, I mean, the taxes and whatnot are already, that piece doesn't play in. It's strictly a rental is a rental, and they're designated as short-term or long-term as far as we're concerned. Go ahead, Megan.
So one of the things that we've talked about in some of our previous meetings, even when we were talking about a joint zoning permit and housing permit process, was that the city would be contracting with a company that can help us to actually monitor listings and compare them back to permits that are on file, as one of the ways for us to ensure that people are actually registering. But Patty, I'm wondering if maybe you could help us understand, like, what happens if we find out that there's a violation of, somebody operating a short-term rental without a permit?
So the way we do it now with like a long-term rental is, and for better or for worse, we're kind of on an honor system. When we discover, because people don't usually say, hey, by the way, I've been renting for 3 years, what do I need to become compliant? When we discover or find an unregistered rental, I usually have that conversation with the property owner, whoever is that I'm connected to. We add a complaint to the property record, and oftentimes these issues come up when a property is getting ready to sell. I don't want to tell all my secrets, but we have a really great working relationship with the fire department, and they go in for time of sale right now, inspections, and notify us that they were talking to the tenant, and they also have access to our database and can tell us, give us the details and look up whether it's a rental or not. When there is an unregistered rental, we have that conversation, we charge them back years, and we make them come into compliance. If it's not being sold, or if it is, depending on what's going on, we will make them come into compliance, whatever that looks like. It can be an order and a report. You're unregistered and you need to register, or it can be much more voluntary than that. Most people are like, I just want to make it right. And I think that's perhaps one area where this group could, that the details need to be worked out on what that might look like for short-term rentals, because the stakes are a little higher and the money involved is a little bit higher, quite frankly. One thing that I meant to mention through the inspection process is there's two ways that we can get into a rental unit. One is basically by invitation. So the property owner is asking us to come in and inspect because they need to be inspected and they're registered with us. The other way is through complaint inspection. And that is for a specific unit that a tenant has possession of. And when somebody calls us and says, I have a complaint about, I don't know, heat or hot water or a leak in the ceiling, we believe them that they're the tenant and can you meet us there? And we go and see whether there's really a leak or is the heat not up to snuff or whatever. And it goes through that same violation or deficiency process, order and report process, like we would for an initial inspection that is, a routine minimum housing inspection. The difference between the minimum housing and the complaint is just who invites us in and the notice given to the occupants at any given time. I would think with a short-term rental, there would be a lot more vacancies. So the issue of notice to tenants might be a non-issue, say. But they would they would have the same due process as, the due process is the same. And it would certainly establish, I would think, if we have some short-term rentals out there, say less than 30 days, if there are issues with habitability, those could be brought up. One of the things that we do know, and I spoke with host compliance early on in this process at a conference, I think it was in Texas. And the reality is the majority, and I'm not going to speak, I don't want to say all, but the majority of your short-term rentals tend to be the basics are covered as far as habitability and safety. However, we don't actually know that until we get into any given unit. So it would be a great check and balance for us to do it in just the same way. And I don't think it would be a huge lift administratively or on the backs of the inspection team. I'm better with answering questions than I am presenting.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the explanation and the answer.
Sure.
Is there anyone else who wants to have any questions, any comments? Harris?
Yeah, I also agree that this is very interesting and worth looking into more. I do have a question on the clarity of the language. A few people have talked about this as a permit, but technically what is it? Is it a registration? Would that be more accurate?
An annual rental registration, Harris. Megan, you've said permit a few times. I know what you mean.
I apologize. I'm used to talking in zoning language.
No, that's fine. I'm just trying to understand. So it's a registration. Okay. Yeah.
Bruce?
So I think probably the downside, depending on what shoes you're in, are if you're an owner and you're not making your expenses under a normal rental situation and you need it to be an STR, you won't be able to rely on doing that. You could be revoked in any year. At the end, it's kind of like a liquor license.
Yeah, it would be annual.
And just so I'm clear, it could be revoked because the policy has changed, or it could be revoked because they're not meeting the standards of Chapter 18, right?
Right. There would need to be a basis to revoke it.
Okay.
And also note, all along through this conversation, we've talked about there being a zoning component and there being a housing code component. So these issues would remain regardless of whether you decide to put the whole thing in Chapter 18 or not. So these are all relevant to the underlying conversation in terms of how do the nuts and bolts work and what do they mean. I don't want folks to think that, we're vetting reasons not to put it in Chapter 18 because we're putting something in Chapter 18 anyway, if that makes sense.
Emily?
Thanks. So I'm curious about the housing replacement fee, or what would be comparable to the housing replacement fee in a situation like this, and what the mechanics of that are.
So the nightly fee we've been talking about is independent of zoning in any event. And as I understand it, is tied to making the charter change for taxation authority.
So until that charter change goes through, there'd be no fee or additional expense for hosts until we talk about 2022.
There would be a rental registration fee, but that would be something different.
Yeah.
I mean, they already pay like the meals and tax, but yes, that's for an additional.
Anyone else?
It's really an interesting concept. Good job, Scott.
So it sounds like I haven't heard anybody who is really against it. I've heard maybe one or two lukewarm, but overall, I think there, at least at this stage of it, without more details behind it all, there's support for it to at least go forward considering it. Do I have that right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I think you have it right, Andy. I mean, my issues are still with, whether or not a host is required to live on site, and the other unresolved issues that we're going to get to next.
Right, and we still have to get to those. So Megan and Scott, assuming that we're open to this idea, which it sounds like, and that we want to, I guess, see what the two codes would look like, the zoning and the, although the minimum housing code, wouldn't be really up to our group to be looking at. That ultimately would just be for the council.
So because this committee has done so much of this work together already, what we envision is that, tonight we can look at, I think as you had indicated at the last meeting, Andy, we can look at the language that we had been developing that was going to be specific to the zoning ordinance and have that conversation about those policy questions and make any tweaks to it that you want. And then what we could do at the conclusion of our conversation is for you to direct staff to determine how that would fit into Chapter 18 instead of into the CDO. And that is the document then that this committee could kind of fine tune and ultimately make recommendations to the council on. You're right that this committee, the Planning Commission, usually does not deal with Chapter 18. The Council Ordinance Committee members that are here do. But I think that, at this point in the process, we would recommend that you kind of collectively make the recommendation to the full council about the policies that you want to be located in Chapter 18.
Okay, so it seems like what would make sense is for us to go through the proposed zoning changes that you've drafted that we have in our packet, fine tune those, get those to see if we could get them where we would want to be, and then send it back to staff, and fine tune it on the policy questions, send it back to staff, and then you figure out where the division is between what's going to ultimately be in zoning and what will be in minimum housing. But the policies would still be the same, whether it's in one or the other. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Okay. So let's do that. Let's go through, and I know there are questions, there are big questions on whether a host needs to live, on site or off site. But all that's laid out in the proposed zoning changes, which start on page 7 of our packet. And so let's go through that. And if people want to talk to that or make specific recommended changes to that, let's do that. So
would you like me to put the language on the Zoom screen, or are you all able to access it on your
do people have the language in front of them, or would you like Megan to put it up?
It would be great if you could put it on the screen.
Okay.
Okay.
So I have a document that separates out, let me see, let me just double check the page numbers on your packet really quick. Separates out page 7, starting page 7, which is the video language. And I have it in Word format so that I can write on it as we're talking as well. Can everybody see this red line Word document?
Yeah.
Okay,
And I think at the beginning, that's the place for us to focus in on, because I think that's where most of the issues that I've heard, particularly at our last meeting, are reflected. And also, when we're on this, I actually can't see everybody. So let me see if I could figure that out a little bit better.
So if any of you want to be able to see too, just you can click in the Zoom window and then hit escape. And it should pop you out of full screen mode, and then you can expand your little box with all the faces in it.
Got it. Okay, Jennifer.
So, and going back through all the notes and everything, I think I understand all of the aspects of this, except for why we would not require it for multifamily. And that's where I was like, why did we draw that line there? I understand that the primary reason we would require it to be the host primary residence is to limit the number of short-term rentals. Like that seems to be the primary sort of mechanism for doing that. But I lost track of why we drew the line at multifamily and allowing for offsite there. So I don't know if you have a recollection of that, or somebody else can enlighten me to that, but that's where I just need a little bit more information about sort of where we came to, like how that line was drawn.
So part of how we arrived at that was back when we were going through all of those scenarios, and we talked about situations where, you know, somebody was renting their own home. We talked about ADU and duplex scenarios, and it was kind of within the conversation about each of those housing types or each of those scenarios that we collected feedback from the committee about whether or not you were open to entertaining the offsite host. I think you've heard a lot of perspectives about this from the hosts themselves. I think some of the committee's attention was focused on those smaller multi-unit properties based on the testimony you were hearing about, you know, real situations where people are using one or maybe more in some cases of their units in a building of 3 or 4 units as a short-term rental, and wanted to enable some of that to happen. But we've as a staff level have had the sense that the committee wasn't as comfortable allowing the offsite hosting in different housing types. And, you know, I think this is an open question for you all to discuss. We have the CDO and many other kind of policy tools that we have in the city make distinctions between, you know, single unit dwellings, duplex dwellings, and then 3 or more unit dwellings. And, you know, we have kind of considered those policies and how we want to treat each of those scenarios within those same buckets of housing types. I think that the requirement to have the host live on site has first the purpose of limiting the number, but then also helps us achieve that goal of making sure that all of the units on a property don't convert to short-term rentals. I think in the case of 2-unit duplex scenarios, ADUs in a single family home, or even in multi-unit properties, you achieve the same thing by the limit to the number of short-term rentals that are allowed to be on the property. It's really only single unit dwellings where, without the owner occupancy requirement, that entire unit, that entire property in essence could become a short-term rental.
Yeah, I think that's where I was getting hung up, because I think we have these 2 mechanisms. You have the owner occupied, plus you have the number of units restrictions. And so I'm like pretty comfortable with where we're at with the number of units that can be converted. But I was getting confused about why we would have it be less restrictive actually for multifamily, where there's, I would guess a lot of people who rent in our city are in multifamily properties, although I could be wrong. I know you have that somewhere. But it's less restrictive for multifamily than those smaller. And so that's where I was getting a little confused about what was the purpose of that.
Yeah, I think as Megan said, one of the main reasons, or the justifications we had, whether we want to change it is another question, was just that we were limiting for the ones that are 3 units or more in a building. We were limiting it by the number of units you can actually have as the short-term rentals. Like if there are more than 7, you could still only have 3 units be. And I think we had come up with one set of numbers before. We changed those limits maybe a couple months ago or a few months ago. And all of it's still on the table really for us to be looking at, but I think that was the justification. So anyone else on this question or anything related, Jack?
Yeah, I mean, I've stated this before, but I think to Jennifer's question, I don't think we should not require it. I think we should require the on-site host across the board. I think the unit limits, I know at a previous meeting I had talked about, even being more restrictive there too, but I'm less, I guess, I feel less strongly about that than I do about the idea of the host living on site. I think there's an additional sort of logic or rationale too, especially with these larger units of sort of the economic impacts. And, we've talked about that a lot, but the idea that just balancing the negative impact of losing housing units and what that does to renters in Burlington, and then this more concentrated economic benefit for folks using Airbnb. But as you get to these larger and larger buildings that folks own and don't live on site, you are inherently talking about folks in our community who have more and more economic resources in the form of that building, in the very least, that they own and don't live in. And that is a really valuable asset that they have in their ownership. And so I think it's a little bit almost backwards in a way to, require the on-site host for the smaller units, but then for these large, for these large properties to not require the host to live on site.
Were other folks with this one? Bruce?
Bruce, you're on mute.
I agree with Jack. I think the greatest risk to the housing stock is with the greater number of units. With some of the tax initiatives that are being proposed, those folks with larger buildings are going to be looking to recover from those initiatives that are probably coming in November and after. So I think that's the risk here. And I would prefer to see the folks at 3 or less having, I think where they have more control, they also have more control over their properties, be able to have more flexibility and not have either host or not, either be host on site or not.
So, and I know this is something that came up in previous meetings. So if we look at the table 5.4.14, that's at the bottom of page 7. This is where we have the matrix that shows how many units are allowed, short-term rentals are allowed relative to the number of units on the property. We did scale this down based on some feedback that Soraya brought to this committee. It used to allow more short-term rentals based on the number of units in the building. But currently we have 1 unit allowed for 3 or 4 unit buildings, 2 for 5 or 6 unit buildings, and then 3 is the maximum allowed in buildings of 7 units or more, regardless of how many more units there are. So is there an interest in reconsidering that upper limit by the committee, or I'm not sure if that's what Bruce or Jack was suggesting.
Jack?
Megan, do you just mean an upper limit overall in the ability to operate a short-term rental period? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think you had heard some comments about, not allowing a period in buildings of certain size or,
Right.
and I don't know if that's what you maybe mean here.
Yeah, for me personally, I would be interested in that, and I had stated that at a previous meeting. I think there was I was maybe a little bit more in the minority on that one, on that particular argument. But yeah, I think for the larger buildings, I for one would certainly be interested in just a straight up, ban essentially.
Jack, for what size buildings? Because right now it's set for like ones that have 7 dwelling units in it. You could have up to 3 short-term rentals, but what would your, just so we all understand where
I
you
think
are.
above 4 units, you start to get into a different category. So I think that could be, that could be the dividing point.
Okay.
I don't know that there's a perfect number, just to be clear, and I certainly don't feel like I'm the expert on where that perfect cutoff is. But I think often 4 and above, or above 4 versus 4 and below is categorized differently and looked at differently. So that could be a logical cutting off point.
What if, I just pose a question, what if it's owner occupied? What if somebody lives in one of the units that owns the building?
Right, I'm gonna jump in. I think that's an example. Like I live in the Riverwatch apartments, which are largely owned. So I mean, like we have units here. We would basically be banning somebody who's like lives in the unit doing short-term rentals for like, I just want to, I know that I think folks are thinking specifically of short-term rentals. I think are thinking of rental units where the whole building is rental, but that's not the only case where that happens. And I guess I would just hesitate to do something that's an outright ban just because it's a larger building.
Bruce?
Well, I think what we're talking about is fee simple ownership in one entity. So if it's a condominium, it's subdivided just like it would be a separate house. So a condominium with 10 units, with a building with 10 units in it, each condominium would be its own ownership and would be treated like a single family dwelling. And I think that's the definition, single family dwelling. I just wanted to also say that I agree with Jack that the dividing line for me is at 4. Below 4, I think folks have sort of stumbled into this in the sense that technology changed and this is a highly regulated environment and they didn't know when they purchased and made a 30-year obligation. So I have a lot more empathy for folks like that than the folks at above 4, where they have the ability and more resources to hire lawyers to understand the zoning code before they did it. So in that sense, I like Jack's proposal because I'd like to see more predictability for the smaller number of units. And as far as protecting the housing stock, I think the greater risk is the multi-unit buildings under common ownership, not condominiums, because I think that's the greater risk. Those folks have the resources to convert these to short-term rentals, hire permanent cleaning staff, and make it take it permanently out of the housing stock.
Chip?
Thanks, Andy. I have a question that may help guide where I come out on this question. I'm struggling in these multi-unit buildings. If we're operating under the assumption that they're all rented, how we're going to manage. So in a 7+ building, if we're allowing 3 units, how are we managing who it is? Meaning there might be 8 people that are all interested in short-term rentals. how, I'm guessing as a city, we're not going to regulate, is it first in? How does that, to me, that becomes a little bit problematic.
I mean, this is something that we talked about when we were debating the idea of a citywide cap. But in this context, it becomes a little more straightforward to regulate that because it's at the individual property level. So maybe Patty or Scott could talk about this a little bit more in terms of, how you get a rental registration for multiple units on the same property. But it's my understanding that we would be able to say, you already have 3 units that are registered as a short-term rental on this property, you can't register another one. But it's at that property level.
So, I mean, I'll give a perfect example, whether it's, let's say mall gets redeveloped and it's 200 units in one building. We say only 3 are allowed. Like, how do we regulate which 3 those are?
Because it's by the property, and we would be able to see that there's 3 of them. And you're right, to some degree, it is first come, first serve. But it's by the property level as opposed to a citywide cap.
Right.
But I think to that point, one of the things that does make this a little bit more flexible, again, moving to chapter 18, is that what unit is the short-term rental in any given year could float around a lot easier than if it was a zoning permit that was being issued.
I mean, the oddity of this discussion as I think through it is like, if we're potentially using 2 levers to try and get at capping, one is the owner occ. If in these large unit buildings, if you went away from any restriction and just went with an owner occ requirement in the mall building, to use that as a perfect example, you could have 200 short-term rentals if every owner occupied unit wanted to make it available, where if we didn't go with short-term and went with a cap, you could have 3. So, I mean, that just highlights nothing's perfect, regardless of what we come out with, it's going to take tweaking is my guess. So I have to confess, I was with Jennifer. I initially felt that the most prudent means beyond single and duplexes to try and get at regulating would be through capping the number of units, whether it's 1, I don't know that 1, 2, and 3 are the right numbers. But I have to confess, I'm not sure that that's perfect in light of this conversation. So sorry to waffle a little bit, but I'm not exactly sure what's the right or the best approach.
Okay. So I have Alex and then Jack, I see you as well. So go to Alex.
I just want to say that I agree with Jack and Bruce on the number of units that were about 4. And we're talking about here about whole unit STRs and buildings. And Chip, I know you understand these things, so I'm just not quite sure what you're not getting. Is it that the idea that all of the tenants in a 200 unit building would turn their units into STRs? But those would be partial units, and we're talking here about whole units. So
right, and I think
don't have the problem that you do.
The other thing to add to that is if owner occupancy is required in, say, a condominium in the same way that a short-term rental would be, what that essentially means is that person is only renting that for a portion of the year, because in order to maintain owner occupancy, it has to be their permanent residence at least half the year. So 200 people are doing it during the summer or during the winter or something like that is different than 200 units that are full-time short-term rentals that may not have anyone living on site for long-term.
Jack?
Yeah, I think that's really kind of what I was going to say is just, I think we're confusing, owner occupied or sort of condominiums with rentals or apartments in the conversation. And we're not saying that a large condo building or a building or owner occupied units within a large building, those owners could still do Airbnb as long as it's their primary residence. So they could either Airbnb out a unit, they could Airbnb out or a room within their unit, or they could Airbnb their unit out just for if they go away for the weekend, things like that. And I think all along, like that type of use of Airbnb, I think hopefully we've never really seen as a problem, or I haven't at least not to the same extent in terms of just someone using their own primary dwelling, either very occasionally or just one room out of it. So I think it's okay. I don't think this is as overcomplicated as we maybe are making it out to be.
So just one thing, we were talking about this, you know, the size of units, the numbers, and Jack, I think you had said, you know, 3, 4, somewhere around there. And I'm just, and I think that makes sense. I'm mindful of, we had one of the people who has been speaking with from the very beginning. Her story with the 3-unit building that her family has owned for years, and I think she said that she rents out 2 of them on a normal basis, and the 3rd unit they keep a lot of flexibility on. Sometimes family members live there, sometimes they do the short-term rental, and that, you know, as I hear her story, as she's talked about that, to me, that's the kind of flexibility that that I actually really look towards in the, I'll say, in the smaller units, number of units, not so much in the larger ones, but in the smaller ones where they're the small family owned, it's the family. We want to give them that flexibility. And her story to me has always made a lot of sense. And I'd want to make sure that, from my perspective at least, that kind of a use could continue, because it just, to me, it just makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. And it seems like if we are talking about like up to 3 or 4, giving that kind of flexibility, and then going over that, you know, something different, to me, that based on that story and stories like that cutoffs make sense to me. Could be workable.
One of the things that we talked about a couple of meetings ago was just, you know, how much of the city's housing stock falls within different types of properties with different numbers of housing units on them, and how many of those are owner versus renter occupied. And, you know, one of the things that, relative to this discussion about where you require an owner to live, is that regulation itself has a greater effect on the smaller properties. The larger multifamily properties, especially if you want to treat condos like single family, you know, many of them are renter occupied anyways, and they're going to be so severely limited by this upper limit, whatever it is, on the number of short-term rentals in the first place. Adding that, and many people have rightly said that they are skeptical that many tenants would even be allowed to rent their own unit as a short-term rental under their leases. So I think the owner occupancy question in those large multifamily rental property scenarios is not as important a lever, I think. I think it becomes a powerful tool one way or the other, regardless of what outcome you want it to have, when you're talking about the smaller properties. Because it could really mean that a property that might be allowed to have 1 short-term rental out of 3 units either can or can't do it based on whether the owner lives on the property.
Jack?
Sorry to keep coming back, Andy. I'll stop after this and let others jump in. I just wanted to clarify what I was saying, or what I was proposing, which sounds like is different from what you were just saying, Andy, and just wanted to be clear. I definitely think owner occupied should be required across the board. What I was talking about with the larger properties is the idea of just not allowing short-term rental at all. So I wasn't saying to eliminate, you know, the owner occupancy requirement for the smaller units. And I think, to Megan's point, that's kind of what Megan was saying, was why I was kind of, again, less adamant about that aspect of the ban, I guess, on the larger ones than I was about, you know, just the owner occupancy requirement across the board.
Thanks for the clarification. Jennifer.
So I was just going back to look at some of the data that was provided. So 50% of all occupied units are in 3 or more, are buildings with 3 or more units. So I think that's where the predominance of the impact is likely to happen on whatever we do. So I'm kind of, I'm liking Jack's suggestion that perhaps just not allowing it at all in buildings of certain sizes, I think is, or number of units is a good idea, because I think that's where we're going to have the most impact. I'm not quite as worried about the primary residence for the duplexes, because it's not that many, it's only 13% of all occupied units. And I think in most cases, what you're seeing is that half of the duplex is owned and half is rented out is probably a pretty typical scenario. So I think my inclination is to look more at number of units that are allowed. And I guess we do need to talk about the primary residence, but I'm less concerned about that and more on the numbers that are allowed and perhaps a cap on a point where they're not allowed at all.
So if I could bring us back to the table that Megan has up, the 5.4.14-1. If folks want to look at that and make some specific recommendations or suggestions on how to modify that if it's not what you want, and then we can start really honing in our discussion on trying to resolve some of these policy questions, but bring focus to it by trying to make the table one that we find acceptable as a group.
So the things that I'm highlighting are, I'm trying to just capture and reflect how this would change if you accept the suggestions that are being offered here. So, I heard Jennifer just now say, think about duplexes differently than a single unit with an ADU. And Jennifer proposed potentially not requiring host to live on site in that scenario. We've got this 3 to 4 unit building size. Above this size, no short-term rentals would be allowed, is something that Jack and Bruce have mentioned. I'm highlighting here the question of, whether or not the host primary residence should be on the lot for all of these, because, Jack has suggested that he's not comfortable allowing the host to live off the site in any of these scenarios, but I'm not sure what other people think about that at this point.
Great. So let's do this. Let's go through that table and we'll start with the single detached dwelling. And does anybody have any concerns or questions or want changes on the single detached dwelling that has 1 unit? You're allowed up to 1 unit, whole unit, host has to be host primary resident, and it's a permitted use. And then later on in here, there are limits on how many days they could rent it out as a short-term rental. But anyone have any questions or concerns on that line?
You can largely ignore the permitted or conditional use column because that won't be relevant under the Chapter 18 shift that we'll make.
What are the limits on the number of days for number 1, single family detached dwelling?
So that really is just driven by the definition of what it means for it to be the host primary residence. So in order for it to be their primary residence, they have to live there for at least half the year.
Okay.
So any concerns on the single detached dwelling line? All right, Bruce?
So I think where I differ from Jack is that anything below 4 units, I would want it to be irrelevant whether the host is on site or not, and disallowed, short-term rentals disallowed above 4 units. I think that would address the housing concerns, and I think it would also allow for folks that have gotten into this not to be harmed by the new policy.
Can you repeat that, Bruce?
So Andy asked on this line what he thinks. Does anyone have any objections? And we're talking about single detached dwellings. So I think anything perhaps 3 or 4 units and below, it shouldn't matter if the host is on site or not. And then short-term rentals should not be allowed for anything above 4 units, let's say. And if that were the case, it would not be allowed at all. So and I think that protects the housing stock, because I think that's where the housing supply is. And it also protects those folks who have signed on to 30-year obligations they can't pay back unless they can they can now rent these as short-term rentals. And I think that's the situation that you have with a lot of the folks that have been following us, is that they're in a situation where they can't meet their mortgage payments, or maybe this is their job. This is their job where they're doing this, and you are putting them out of a job by doing this. This is how they make the money that they live on. The reason a lot of people don't do short-term rentals is that it is a lot of work. And so for me, that strikes a balance that I can feel good about, with the philosophy that we try not to do harm. And I think we'll do substantial harm if we don't allow it to be permissive at the lower levels.
So in
Thank you.
this
That's what I
circumstance,
thought you said. Excuse me, that's what I thought you said. I like that thinking, yeah.
in this circumstance, if the host residency is required, somebody who owns a single family home could still rent their own home for a portion of the year, not to exceed, half the year. Or they could rent rooms in their home for any number of nights throughout the year. So they do still have a path. So the change to not require a host to live on site in a single family home would mean that, any single family home could be rented as a short-term rental for any duration of time.
Bruce?
But by going into Title 18, it's like a liquor license. If the city wants to issue 40 liquor licenses in a year, that's all they have to issue. So the city has substantially more control over the number of units in this context.
Jennifer?
It seems like by requiring the owner owner occupied, it would prevent like me from buying the house across the street from me. That's a single family home, and just using it for an STR, right? So I'd live across the street, but I wouldn't be able to just buy a home and turn it into an STR. Is that correct?
That if the residency was required, that would be true.
So I think that's actually something we want to be careful of, is people just buying properties to turn into as income to turn into short-term rentals, particularly whole homes, which can be pretty attractive to travelers some travelers, and then taking single family homes off the market, basically. So I actually would not be in favor. In this case, I actually think that I have a different opinion about the duplexes, but for single family homes, I have a different, this one I think should be the primary residence.
Bruce?
What would you think, Jennifer, if the city set a limit? Remember, let's say 200 of these a year. Let's say we figure out that there are 200 there now, and the city set a limit, and they won't issue any more of these licenses than 200 per year. By pushing it into Title 18, I think we take care of this problem without having to get into the weeds on it, in other words.
Yeah, I get that. I have a bit of an issue with like putting an overall cap for the city, because I don't know. I don't like the idea that whoever's just able to game the system gets the benefit and others are just out. So I guess my philosophy around policy is that it's not my favorite way to manage that, but I get what you mean, for sure.
So looking at the single detached dwelling, Bruce is suggesting that, and it's a part of a larger picture, but on this line itself is suggesting that the host not be required to live on site in that building. Does anyone else go along with that at this point? Harris? Okay. And I'm kind of flexible on it, but I could live with it the way that it is. Chip?
So I'm not, and I just want to explain why. Jennifer's hypothetical is happening in my neighborhood now. I mean, I'm aware of 4 homes that have been acquired by people who are renting them out as STRs. And all I think of is that, that's 4 houses without kids that aren't going to Champlain, Edmonds, and BHS. And that doesn't feel good as a city councilor.
So it doesn't, Zariah?
Yeah, sorry, and this might be a little bit of a, but to some extent, it does feel a little bit weird to me to say that we want to preserve the neighborhoods that are large single-family homes and not allow short-term rentals there, but it's more acceptable in some of the multi-unit. I guess I just don't understand. It, like, that feels wrong to me, is to say we want to preserve the large, like, single-family homes, but like unit, like apartment, those are fine. And so I think conceptually I have a problem with that. And then the other thing that I just want to say, although I'm not sure it'll really change the things of the debate, is to me it still is relevant in terms of host and not host. And I guess just for folks to keep in mind is I hope that an eventual outcome that we can have is seeing one more as an investment and a replacement and one not so much, so that we can use different fee or tax order that is going to be levels to have to differentiate between those as opposed to allowing and not allowing.
So you mean, for example, if a single family home had a host living on the property, its property tax burden or whatever fee burden would be very small, but if it was if the host did not live on the property, it would be much higher.
Right.
I think that's the way it would work, because your primary residence is taxed one way, but your commercial property is taxed a different way. So like
From a
ones that are
property
just
taxation
rental,
perspective, yeah.
right? I'm not sure if I don't think I'm seeing support for it to change for the single detached from or host is required to not being required. I don't know, Bruce, if you wanted to make a motion or if you want to just go along with that. I don't think it's there. Okay. Then unless somebody wants to make a specific proposal, I think we're set with the single detached dwelling line. Then we'll move on to the single detached dwelling with an ADU or duplex. That one, two dwelling units in the building, up to one whole unit could be done as an STR, and the owner has to be on at least one of the units.
And the main reason that's driving this requirement is that in order to have an ADU, it has to be on an owner occupied property.
Anyone have any changes they want to see on that one? Alex?
How does this deal with the issue of people who have like the adjoining lot has an STR? And that's essentially how they pay their property taxes. Or is that something-
Honestly, zoning doesn't contemplate that. We are aware that there is someone who has been an active participant here that has single family homes on adjoining lots that have been deemed merged from a taxation perspective. Zoning treats them as separate lots and each lot is regulated by whatever standard. I would look to others like the city attorney or Scott or Bill and Patty on whether or not that changes under Chapter 18.
It doesn't. I would say it's not just zoning that comes into play here. They're separate lots. The fact that the assessors combines them for a single bill is simply streamlining the administrative billing process. That's really it. There's no implication on the lots actually being merged. They're separate properties. So owner occupied would be the same under the zoning code as it would under Chapter 18.
So the short answer is a single unit property with an ADU is not the same as two neighboring properties under common ownership with individual buildings.
Does anyone want to see any changes on the duplexes? Jennifer?
I have a question. Is there a way to separate ADUs and have two different categories, an ADU category and a duplex category?
We can. I just pulled the duplexes down a little bit lower, but we can make that distinction.
Did you want them to be different, Jennifer?
Well, I'm kind of tussling with this. I feel like we did hear some feedback. I am thinking of the same scenario that somebody was just discussing. And because duplexes are probably the smallest proportion of units, housing units in the city, I'm a little less concerned about the overall impact of that. But at the same time, I think if we sort of carve them out for not having this, it could create a loophole that people want to take advantage of. So I'm kind of having a bit of an internal debate on this. But I do think that it might be worth just exploring whether it makes sense to separate. I completely agree, ADU. I want to preserve the regulation around ADUs, but I'm kind of undecided on duplexes.
Just so I'm clear, when you're for the duplexes, what would you prefer seeing, or what are you thinking you might want to see?
I'm actually just tussling with whether you need to have the owner occupied piece.
Okay.
And in previous meetings, we've heard a couple of things about this. One is, that data about housing units that you mentioned did indicate that, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was a pretty significant proportion of the housing units that are located in duplexes are rented. So that's what we know about the current scenario. But I know Emily had also offered some perspective on, if owner occupancy is required, does that actually become an incentive to buying and purchasing and occupying one half of a duplex? So I hear you about, that one feeling like it's hard to decide if it feels more like a single family home or more like a multi-unit property.
Did you want to propose a change, or should we leave it alone for right now?
So right now, this is reflecting what I heard Jennifer kind of wrestling with, but currently required would be in this column for duplexes under what was in your packet.
Right. So the host is required. It's required. The resident is required to be in one half of the duplex or the ADU.
That's
Okay.
correct.
I'm not seeing anyone jumping to change that.
Sorry, if I can.
Oh, Zariah, sorry.
Yeah, so I guess, and this is a wider question as well, but I guess to some extent, I'm sympathetic to both like the quest to just generally make sure that we don't have too many short-term rentals, because I very solidly believe that it does affect our long-term rental market. But to another extent, now that we've got a little bit more flexibility in terms of how quickly we can change this, I guess I wonder what the, if there's any, I guess, I kind of feel like it almost makes sense to be more permissive to some extent, given that we're putting it into Chapter 18, just so that we can have a better sense of how many people actually want this kind of permit, because I think it just gives us more data. I can also, I'm arguing with myself now, which is not a favored behavior among counselors, but I can also see the counter argument to that it's harder to take things away again once you allow it. But I guess I wanted to throw that out there, especially as it comes to duplexes, because I think I would want to know what the demand is for.
So we have at least two people who sound like they're open to the possibility of duplexes not having the host be required to live there. Bruce, you're on mute.
I guess this would fit with what Bruce was proposing earlier.
Yeah.
Right, I'd be the third, I think.
Okay. And I could live with that. Where are other people? Could others, is that all right with anyone else to have for the duplex to not have it be owner occupied? I
have a question that relates to this.
Yes, Emily.
I'm wondering, as we're talking about this, someone who is not owner occupied, let's say we require owner occupied for all of these things, someone who wants to do this with 3 to 4 units or with a duplex or whatever we decide, they would still have the ability to change their use to a hotel, right? And go through the formal process of becoming a hotel and paying the housing replacement fee. So it is still open, I would think, to being Airbnb'd through another avenue. So-
Except hotels are not a permitted use in
Okay.
residential zoning districts.
Where
Okay,
hotels
there you
are
go.
permitted.
All right, yeah, where hotels are permitted to be able to, okay, gotcha. Because that might be a workaround too, that like, you can do it, but you have to go through the process of changing your use. So anyways, just a thought.
Jack?
Yeah, I just think in response to Zariah's question, I think we are still going to see a lot of, duplex owners who do live in one of the two units under this would be permitted to Airbnb that other unit. And so we are still going to see, I think, a lot of this happen. It's not like we're not going to know sort of who wants to use this or understand that. So I still think we should restrict it for the time being. And then we could always, to the point Emily has raised in a bunch of meetings, like it's easier to loosen than to tighten from there.
Alex?
I agree. I'm not wild about relaxing the restriction on owner occupancy of duplexes because I think that'll lead to more conversions from long-term to short-term rentals. So that's where I'm at.
Anyone else on this one? Sounds like we are somewhat split on it. And as has been pointed out, if this is going into the minimum housing code, it is easier to change it than if it's in zoning one way or the other. So do you want to do a vote on this one, or should we just say no to it, to just leave it as the owner occupied?
I think Jack and Alex convinced me. So I think if we do want to later on know if there's a huge press for people to want to do that, I want to know, but I don't know if wanting to know is justifying the potential entrenchment of having more folks feel entitled to that.
Okay. So it sounds like it's more leaning towards leaving it the way it is, where the host is required to live in one of the two units. Does anyone want to change that for now, or should we keep going? All right, so it sounds like then we're set with the single detached, with the ADU and duplex for the way that it's written right now. And the big one then is the attached dwelling multifamily with 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 plus. Let's do it 3, 4, where the host is not, you could have up to one unit be the short-term rental, and the host is not required to live on site. Anything people want to change, or are they okay with that? This one I'm okay with.
Could you elaborate, Councilor Montrell, why that you were okay with that? This is the sticking point right here.
This one is probably
He's not a counselor, Alex.
Well, one of the things, I'll go back, and as I was saying before, I'm mindful of the way that one of the folks who have been coming to us a number of times, I forget what her name is, but she's been here a lot, where she has the 3-unit building. I think it's on Elmwood Avenue, and 2 of the units are rented basically as regular long-term rentals, and one of the units she has kept with a lot of flexibility. One of the units, sometimes the family member may live in there for a while, sometimes they rent it out for a few months at a time, sometimes they use the short-term rentals, and they go back and forth on that. And the way that she's described it to me actually sounds really compelling and really useful. And I think giving somebody that kind of flexibility for one of the units in a 3 or 4 unit structure, I think actually could really help with our housing issue, because it makes it more possible for them to continue to rent the other units. And I think for the smaller units, these aren't the big commercial landlords. This is the kind of place where I think we want to give the flexibility. And again, we've heard her story. She's told it to us a few times, and to me, it's really compelling. So anyone else on this?
I agree with you on that, Andy.
All right. Not seeing anyone to change what's on 3 or 4. What about 5, 6, which allows for 2 whole units? And again, host is not required to live on site. And this is the one I think where we're getting into more conversation. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think this is the one where we want to talk about whether, do we want to just not allow this at a certain size? And I think this is the cutoff that we're looking at, as whether this just would not be permitted at all. I think that's the first question, really, in my mind. And then if we think it should be permitted, then I would say, we'd want to be consistent with those larger units. But to me, in my mind, this is where, if we're really worried about the rental market, that this is where we might see the biggest impact of a policy that would allow for short-term rentals in these types of buildings. And so that's where I'm kind of open to the idea of looking at just not allowing this.
And
So
so
Andy,
for that,
can I make a point of clarification before we get into this?
Scott, yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but this is getting into, I heard 2 different things before with respect to allowing versus not allowing in these larger buildings. And so I want to clarify this. So are we talking about, I heard that there was not interest in limiting the number of short-term rentals in large multi-unit buildings so long as it's the host's primary unit being rented. Is that right? That's different from a large multi-unit building, like let's say it's the Vermont House downtown, where the host lives on site, but they own another apartment in the building, right? That's a little bit different. So I want to be clear that we're talking about limiting the numbers across the board, or are we making a carve out for short-term renting your own unit?
Seems like we need another category.
It seems to me, and I thought that was that you use the example of the Vermont House. If somebody's living there, and those are, if they're living there and they want to rent out their unit for a weekend or something like that, that they ought to be able to do that. I think what we're talking about is that if the whole building was owned by somebody and that they can't take specific units and just dedicate those for short-term rentals. Am I saying that correctly? That where people are on? I think that's what I've heard, but
those are 2 bookends, Andy. My example of the Vermont House, those are largely condos, as I understand. But it's possible for one condo owner to own a second one, right? That they then use as a short-term rental. So it seems to me that the carve out we're talking about here is that we wouldn't limit the number of owner-occupied short-term rentals, regardless of the building unit count.
If it's owned by the person who's renting it.
Correct.
Does that sound right to people?
I think Jack has made this distinction before in previous meetings, that the way that the ordinance has been structured at this point, it says, the property is the host primary residence. So I think that's one of the big distinctions that Scott and Andy are talking about right now. If I live in Vermont House and I own another apartment that I'm using as a short-term rental, I meet that requirement for having my primary residence in that building. But I think what Jack has said before is we could also make the distinction that it is the actual unit that you live in that has to be your primary residence and is the one that you are then able to short-term rent. We could make that distinction as a carve out from banning outright the allowance for people to have another unit within the same building where they live as a short-term rental.
To me,
Isn't
that's the
that the
distinction.
distinction being made in the first row was single detached dwellings in condominiums, that you're saying that the unit that's being rented as a short-term rental is the host's primary residence?
And I think that's what I would go along with. I wouldn't want somebody in one of those, again, I mean, we're using the Vermont house as an example, somebody to own one unit or to own 2 units and they rent out as an Airbnb, one of them. It's not where I'm necessarily in favor of doing that, but I would be in favor of them doing their own unit that they do live in. Soraya?
Yeah, I feel like this is a little bit confusing, mostly because of these restrictions that we had, we were doing it on a building type basis, when it feels like now we're switching to only talking, because it's still confusing to me. I mean, Bruce made the point that, you know, condos wouldn't be in this, but it is, I feel like if I were, you know, a citizen reading this, I'd be like, oh, I'm a attached dwelling multifamily. I wouldn't go and look at single detached dwelling as my unit. So I feel like it feels like we're fundamentally thinking about how we're changing regulating these from the building to the unit. I don't know if anybody else is seeing that.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. The way you said that.
Yeah, I mean, we have talked about this before, that whether a building, because we've been using at this attached dwelling multifamily definition, we've been using our zoning definition of that, which doesn't care about owner versus renter occupied units. It's just about the number of units that are physically within that building. So prior to tonight's discussion, the limits that were applicable to multi-unit buildings would have been applicable whether it was an owner or renter occupied building. So the shift to create this carve out for condos and treat them as single unit dwellings is definitely a change.
Okay, that's how I was reading it. So I was confused when it was like condos aren't included. I'm like, I think it is. Okay.
So can I just ask a question? So if you're a tenant, so say Vermont House was all renters and not condos, could a renter do an Airbnb in the apartment that they are living in? Or that have to be part of their lease? Because that's what I was kind of reading, that in the definitions of host being owner or tenant.
So that was one of the things that we were talking about like the risk of confusing the host primary residence with owner occupancy. When this ordinance was originally drafted, they did not mean the same thing. As we've discussed this more, we are coming to understand that the committee wants that to actually mean owner occupancy. But I do know that in the last meeting, you all did have a discussion about, you know, if a landlord is amenable to it and a tenant wants to rent their own unit as a short-term rental, that would be a scenario we wanted to allow for. So I think that is something that we need to be clear about, like how you want us to write this, because it might be that you decide that in buildings over a certain size, it doesn't matter if they're owner or renter occupied, you just don't want to allow short-term rentals in them. It could be that in buildings over a certain size, you only want to allow the unit that the host themselves lives in, that it's their primary residence regardless of who they are. Whereas some of the other scenarios allow you to potentially rent a unit that you don't live in, but's in the same building.
To me,
I wonder.
But I'm kind of leaning
Yeah,
towards
go
is
ahead.
that second scenario.
I wonder if I am also sympathetic to people who are renting an apartment, are going on a vacation during marathon weekend and decide, you know, I can make $1,000 if I list my apartment on Airbnb for marathon weekend. That's the scenario that I see for tenants renting their own apartment. So I wonder if we can get around that by just saying, or accommodate that in a simple way by saying that, you know, you can, I don't know what the limit is now for the number of days you can short-term rental, but maybe we make it something like, you know, 90 days. Anybody can short-term rental their own you know, a unit for 90 days. And that also gives people some flexibility. Like, let's say you're buying a building and you want your lease to start in June and you have 3 months for whatever reason. You could short-term rental until June, or you're doing work on the building and you want it to start at the same time as all the other leases, stuff like that. So maybe extending the timing for allowing short-term rentals from whatever it is now to something like 3 months would help accommodate tenants renting out their units, which I think is something we all want, because if the city was to open up more bedrooms for things like the marathon and for Brew Fest and all those events that bring a lot of people for peak hotel time, I think that would be in everybody's benefit.
So the only thing that I'll just add to that is that right now, the ordinance really doesn't consider the number of nights you rent as a short-term rental. The only way that that's considered is if it has to be your primary residence. And so there's, you know, it would be limited to no more than half the year that you could do it. We don't otherwise restrict the number of nights that somebody could rent a unit or part of a unit as a short-term rental. And in a lot of the stuff that Scott and I have read about guidance about short-term rental policy is that that's a really hairy thing for us to get into regulating and enforcing. That said, when we were talking about the zoning ordinance, we have reminded the committee on a couple of occasions that, you know, anyone can do this for less than 30 days a year and zoning wouldn't even touch it. So if that's I guess an intention that you want to continue to have as we move over to chapter 18, staff could follow up on, you know, how we might be able to consider that.
Sorry, clarifying question on that. So before, yeah, it had been the 30 days, and you're saying that would be one flip as we do to 18, that wouldn't be true anymore if we didn't impose such a kind of floor.
Unless we carry it through.
I wouldn't say it's not true. I would say it's moot, right? I mean, the 30 days is significant only under the zoning code, because something less than that doesn't need a zoning permit.
Right.
That number is not significant under 18.
Right.
So it could be the same, could be different. You have the flexibility, but we should just define it if you want it.
As a follow-up question, as we move from zoning into minimum housing, would you need to get the whatever, pay the $100 to register before or after the 30-day period? Is that as well as, I mean, my belief is we're collecting the tax if it's listed through the Airbnb platform, regardless of whether it's registered or not.
I think some people have mentioned that there might be a tax exemption if it's below a certain number of nights, but I can't remember the specific details. Generally, though, I think that they would be paying applicable taxes, however the laws would require.
I
So
think
our 30-day
Airbnb
trigger
collects that.
is really just whether you need to register with permitting and inspection and pay the fee.
Well, I want to be clear. I have a note here, Chip, that we need to figure out what that bar is.
Okay.
Into 18, right? And going back to what I heard from the state folks more than a year ago, they said if you do a short-term rental, even a single night, you need to adhere to the applicable life safety standards, right? So does that mean you need to register if you just do a single night? So we need to figure out that bar.
And I'm just thinking through, there's an education piece that's going to need, because most people who think I'm going to rent my house on marathon weekend don't think I need to register with permitting and inspection. There are life safety inspection requirements. Just so that's a lot to put on Bill's department without a serious educational piece that follows it.
So the hour's getting late. Let me summarize where I think we might be on the multi-dwelling units. For 3 to 4 people, or 3 to 4 units in a building, we could have up to 1 unit being a short-term rental, and the host is not required to be on site. For anything more than 4 units in a multifamily building, I think we're leaning towards, or maybe we're there, that you can't have any the I'll call it the landlord or the owner of the whole structure can't rent out short-term rentals, but any of the residents of any of the individual units there, we have the flexibility to let them, whether they own the condo that they own, whether it's a rental unit that they're renting, and they would obviously need the landlord's approval to do that, but to let the occupant of the unit do the short-term rental, but not the overall building owner do it, unless they're an occupant of one of the units, and then they could do their own unit. Did I characterize that correctly? Is that what I've been hearing from people? I'm not seeing anyone disagree. Megan, Scott, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that's what I heard.
Okay. I think we could wind up our discussion for tonight. I think we've given a lot of stuff for Scott and Megan to do the next version that would be the splitting it now between the zoning code and the minimum housing code. And we are having does anyone have anything else to add? Our next thing that we would do is the public forum. And I have a thought on the public forum, but anyone want to add anything else on this?
Just quickly, and sorry for the camera angle, I need to stand up. But, I hope we can get through this in a decent amount of time, but I hate to change it, but I do almost think that we should consider just having a limit and going that direction, even though I know, Jennifer, you mentioned that's not your favorite way to go, but it might address, the core issue of we don't want too many of these. And so we just set a limit, and then that might be a path forward if what we're doing now doesn't really move us forward.
So Harris, if I could make a suggestion, rather than getting into that debate now or that discussion now, let's see what Scott and Megan come up with for the proposed changes to what we've talked about tonight. And that could be one of our topics in our next discussion on this. After we look at that and see, should we be putting a limit on an overall limit?
I agree. I don't think it's discussion for tonight. I'm just putting it out there as a possible path. Yeah.
Anyone else before we close out and go to the public forum? Okay, so we'll close this item. Great, I think it's a really good discussion. Item 4 is a public forum on the short-term rentals. And again, the hour is late, and we'll welcome people if they want to speak now. But what I would suggest as well is at our next meeting where we bring this up, we'll have the revised language from Scott and Megan. They'll go through for us what they're proposing, but what they're proposing to reflect what we were talking about tonight. And then after that, we'd go to a public forum. And so people from the public could have the specific language in front of them over what they'd be commenting on. And that could also, I think, be a more productive time, both for us and perhaps for them, to be able to comment on some more details that will be presented to us. But I also don't want to cut off people if they want to talk tonight, because we did promise them that. So with that, and again, first item that we'll do after we hear the presentation at our next meeting, we'll be having the public forum on all of this before we go back into committee discussion. With that, Megan, is there anybody who wants to speak to us tonight?
So I had a couple of people that reached out before the meeting. So why don't I see if they want to speak tonight or if they want to wait until the next meeting first?
Okay.
Okay. So the first one is Sharon Busher. Would you like to speak tonight or wait?
Megan?
Yes.
Did you recognize me?
Yes. If you want to speak tonight, or you can wait until next time too.
Hi, this is Sharon Busher, and I'll be very brief. I found this conversation, well, I wasn't prepared for the direction that you were recommending, Chapter 18, but I found it really interesting. And I also wanted to just say that I'm happy with where you've landed with duplexes right now being owner occupied. For me, it also, when in that scenario, it provides stability for neighborhoods, and that's a big piece to me and in the ward that I live in. So I just am glad that that's where you are right now. I know it could change because it was controversial. The multifamily going to one short-term rental for 3 or 4 unit also seems really, without the host being required to be on site, is in keeping with what I heard when I was a part of that committee. And I'm trying to be responsive to what I know is on the ground. I kind of got lost with the Vermont house, although as a census worker, I can tell you that a lot of those condos in there are actually second homes, and people they aren't owner occupied, and they are rented as short-term rentals all the time. And I don't know how we'll ever really nail that down, and I'm not sure you need to get in the weeds that way. I just wanted to say that as far as multifamily, multi-units that are greater than 4 units, I had given some feedback to David and Megan, and I don't remember whether I had them share it with you all, but I still thought that the flexibility of having one short-term rental in any of these big units could be advantageous, because I think a lot of you are focused on just a few really dominant property owners, but there are other people in the community that own some larger apartment units, but they own maybe 1 or 2. And I do believe that the money that they can get from short-term rental allows them to maintain those structures in a way that we all benefit from, including the tenants. So that's it. Thank you very much. I know it's late. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, the next person that contacted me before the meeting was Ellis McArdle. I'm looking at Jamie Sharp. I think this is Ellis.
Yeah,
Would you
hi.
like to speak tonight?
I'm actually going to speak next time, just out of respect for everybody's time. I think, over 2 hours in, it's not going to what I intended at this point. So I'm going to reserve it.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, the next person that reached out was Julie Marks.
Hi. Yes, I would like to speak briefly if I may. I've mainly, and Andy, thank you for being empathetic to my situation. I wholeheartedly appreciate that support, but I would, before you go off and craft any new language, I would like to draw your attention to a recommendation that was submitted to you before the meeting. Members, you should find this in your packet. And I would ask that you find that so you can look at the table of recommendations that I'm going to be talking about. And for those who are on the call and haven't seen this document, you can find it on the Planning Commission website under the supporting documents for this meeting. But anyways, a number of us hosts have gotten together and put forward some recommendations that we believe meet some mutual objectives for us all, with our top goals are being to simplify these regulations. As you can tell, every time you discuss this, they seem to get more and more convoluted. We also want to fulfill the 2019 Housing Summit objective of collecting true and accurate data on the STR activity in Burlington. And we also, like you, want to prevent SDRs from uncontrollably concentrating and replacing long-term housing. So with those goals in mind, we are recommending that STR allowance be based on 2 factors: the Burlington Land Use Code designation and the Burlington zoning map. And our permitting structure was simple. I know this may change with everything potentially moving to Chapter 18, but the premise hopefully will stick, which is that residential lots codes R1 through R4, which are single family home, duplexes, triplexes, and up to 4-unit multifamily should be permitted to operate one short-term rental in all zones. And that's it. This recommendation achieves the goal of crafting the simplest policy possible, removing all the nuance of how STRs can be different. Just call an STR an STR, regardless of any other variable, host status, whole v partial, whatever. By removing those variables of owner occupancy and whole unit and partial unit, you remove the complicating, undefinable, and unfixed variables from your data. It is impossible to capture or even predict all plausible scenarios. So this allows for equity. This allows an STR to either be owner operated or renter operated, to be whole unit or partial unit and everything in between, to be host occupied or not, to be an STR for all of the year or part of the year, for 1 year, for 10 years. In this proposal, an STR is an STR and everybody gets one, with maybe a conditional maximum of 2 per residential lot. We also suggested that properties designated with commercial land use code, such as Northgate or Jackson Terrace and other large complexes, have the autonomy to allow or prohibit STRs within their own HOAs or CCRs. And if HOAs allow short-term rentals or they don't exist, any STR in a commercial building would be subject to DRB review and conditionally permitted in order to prevent unreasonable number of STRs from concentrating in those larger buildings. We also propose that any new ordinance make it abundantly clear that operating short-term rentals in any affordable unit, i.e. housing receiving public funding, is prohibited everywhere in Burlington. Violators should be fined and ordered to cease and desist. Along with this simple and effective permitting structure, we also recommended 5 supplemental policies and procedures, primarily being that an annual registration process for STRs be created by the City of Burlington, which you guys discussed, and I was encouraged to hear that. And as a part of that, we are suggesting an STR operation fee of $100 per STR per year, in addition to any long-term apartment registration fee that may apply. We feel that this fee should be directed to the Burlington Housing Trust Fund, and that any rooms and meals taxes that Burlington collects from STRs should also be directed to the Burlington Housing Trust Fund. Altogether, our recommendations offer a strong compromise, limits on STRs, and a solution to the problem of housing availability, which is a problem of funding for new housing development, not STRs. By enacting our recommendations, the City of Burlington would likely achieve several favorable outcomes. One being a very clean definition for what a short-term rental is, based solely on the number of consecutive nights rented. 2, a new system for registration and data collection, as all registration forms can be used to collect the data you need to confidently assess and weigh all of the impacts, good and bad, that STRs are having on Burlington's housing market, community, and economy. Our recommendations would help Burlington achieve better monitoring and enforcement because it is easy to enforce a limit of STRs based on parcel ID or SPAN number, and it is easy to enforce permitting of STRs per a property's land use code. Our recommendations would give Burlington a new, reliable, and substantial source of annual income for the Housing Trust Fund, upwards of $140,000 a year. And lastly, our recommendations would achieve the goal of protecting our housing stock while providing opportunity for everyone to participate in the home sharing marketplace equitably, but not excessively. Our recommendations would work because they are clean and simple, and they are intentionally broad because they should be viewed as a first step. Step 1 is to create a system to collect real data on Burlington short-term rentals while putting protections against everyone's greatest fear. Then in a couple of years, re-examine your data and information on short-term rentals. Then you'll be able to define them more accurately, assess their impact more authentically, and ultimately craft better regulation. Regulation that is based on evidence and impact analyses. I recognize that our call for better data has not resonated with many of you, but the reason we are so hard pressed for it is because we know that the adverse impacts are not as bad as you think. according to the information you have, Burlington has at most 280 whole units, in quote, STRs today. If there are 17,000 rental units, that's only 1.6% of them being listed as STRs. That's already pretty low, but that number doesn't account for a number of things. It doesn't account for short-term listings that operate as long-term rentals part of the year. Like my unit, I use as a long-term rental for half of every year, even though the short-term listing is active all year long. It doesn't account for the way Airbnb defines whole unit, which is different than how you are defining it. So it would be difficult to use Airbnb data to monitor and track. And it doesn't, and also, for example, a guest suite in without a kitchen in a house can be listed as a whole unit on Airbnb, but in real life, that space would not be suitable for long-term living and is not a detraction from the long-term housing. Those numbers don't account for listings that have a 30-day minimum stay, like Emily Lee's 6 Airbnb listings, which she claims has all 30-night minimums. They are misrepresented in the data entirely as short-term. It doesn't account for when someone rents my studio for 3 months in the summer through Airbnb, and the city collects 90 days of rooms and meals tax. It doesn't account for the long-term duration of short-term rental use. An STR is not an STR forever. I don't plan on operating my studio as an STR forever. It's not my forever job, I hope, although I'd like to continue it for at least another few more years. When my life changes or I sell my property, STR may not exist on my lot anymore. But even if a property is used as an STR for over 10 years, the lifespan of a house or an apartment is 50 to 100, leaving decades of future housing opportunity available. So in closing, I ask that you please not end your discussion yet and seriously consider our recommendations that have been presented in your agenda packet. We are asking for a simple and reasonable compromise. Permit a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 2 short-term rentals for all residential properties, regardless of host status or type, and require conditional permitting for anything beyond. We think this is a solid compromise that does no harm, only good. If you move forward with the proposal the way you have it now, you will be harming hundreds of families whose livelihoods desperately depend on the security that short-term rentals provide. And I say that on behalf of my fellow hosts, whose scenario has been drastically affected by the changes you made here tonight. And that's all I will say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next person was Deb Lyons. Would you like to speak tonight or at a future meeting?
No, I would like to speak tonight, please. Okay. And I completely agree with Julie that just spoke. Once again, I appreciate your time and commitment to the discussion tonight and to listening to my and other homeowners' concerns and questions. I will be brief, and I wish to address the concept that off-site hosts should not be allowed in single and duplex circumstances. And my comments are in relation to tonight's discussion. It is obviously, oh golly, it is within your power. You can allow, with reasonable limits, one homeowner to operate one property as an off-site host. In other words, allow STRs in a single, duplex, ADU, and you were already talking about triplex buildings, where the host lives in another Burlington or Vermont location. Renting my single standalone building in a variety of ways allows me to stay in my home and make ends meet, including paying the city's increasing taxes and utility bills. My STR is my livelihood. I work 3 jobs to keep my home. I will be 65 years old in April, thank you very much, and I am not in a position to retire and collect Social Security. My STR is my lifeline to maintaining my homestead of 40 years. In addition, it allows me the flexibility to rent and support others in a variety of ways. My rental has housed my children during the pandemic, long-term renters, Bernie Sanders campaign workers, family members recovering from major surgery, homeless individuals with mental health challenges, short-term renters, and even my former husband during our separation. The full picture is this. My rental is a house, again, right next door, of many different scenarios, meeting many different family and community needs in the course of a year. I have lived in Burlington for 45 years. This property is home to me and my children. Please find a way to allow the very few of us who are small property landlords and allow STRs to operate in Burlington in all residential zones with an off-site owner. You are in a position to find a compromise with both STR owners and tenant needs. I encourage you in finding this compromise path. Please allow off-site owners for single and standalone buildings. I end my case.
Thank you. Again, I just want to remind everybody that there'll be the opportunity before the committee talks, gets into our discussion at our next meeting for public to weigh in. So you could do tonight or you could do it the next one, but there will be an opportunity before we start our discussion again.
The next person that I see here is Erhard Manka.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Yes.
So I am cognizant of the late hour, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to make the next meeting. So I'd like to just briefly provide a couple of comments. One is I really find the idea of going to Chapter 18 as a very elegant potential solution. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that as well. I think, rentals, as I think Patty said, rentals are rentals, whether short-term or long-term. And there are many parallels and should be regulated in a similar way. I'll also note that, in wearing my statewide affordable housing lobbyist hat, those of us who are involved with the statewide rental housing advisory board are putting forward a bill that would do much the same in terms of regulating both short-term and longer-term rentals in a similar way on a statewide basis. And I'm working with Councilwoman Carpenter, who's the chair of that rental housing advisory board on that. So I think it's a really interesting solution. And we'll try to wrap my head around a little more between now and the next meeting. I will say that, as I think as a long-term affordable housing advocate, definitely fall on the side of greater regulation and more restrictive regulation. I agree with those who have said that for 5 units and above, you should simply ban them. I think there is a big divide between folks like Deb and others that you've heard from who are trying to make ends meet, and for them it's a matter of economic survival. And I think you can probably find a way to integrate, to create some form of grandfathering, even if you move to Chapter 18, to allow those to happen. Because I'm clearly, as an owner occupant in a duplex myself, which is, part of why we're able to continue to live in Burlington. I'm sympathetic to folks who are trying to make ends meet and need some income. But there's a sharp dividing line between that and people who might be able to buy up single family homes, as Jen mentioned earlier, and turn them into short-term rentals. That whole investor class, I think you really need to look sharply at preventing that. I would argue that for 3 and 4 unit properties, you should require owner occupancy as well. But then for the folks that are currently doing this and have been doing it for the last few years, that need it as part of their livelihood, I would find a way to grandfather them. But you really can't make. I don't think you should be making citywide policy based on a couple of individual instances. I mean, this is always the tension between anecdote and making policy based on anecdote or individual instances and doing it on a very broad basis. So I think grandfathering is the mechanism to allow you to make accommodations for folks that are maybe unique in their current use. So I'll end there, and thank you for your good work.
And the last person I see is Amy Magyar.
Thanks so much, Megan. I'll keep it as short as I possibly can. I just want to say that this is the second time that we've heard Earhart mention as a housing advocate to grandfather a group of people in who are using short-term rentals as a way to be able to own their homes. I think it's shocking. He didn't just say it once. He came on today to say it again. I think it's got legs. One of the things I just want to leave you all with is this. Airbnb and the Burlington group of hosts have been in contact because obviously Airbnb is very fearful of what might happen if we overregulate. They would have reminded us and are shocked that Burlington is focusing on really restricting whole units that only make up 13% of our overall sort of property mass here in Burlington, and being so much more lenient, including not requiring potential owner occupancy for larger units, because what they have found globally is that the problem is not with single standing units. I'm sorry to hear that in Chip's neighborhood that there's been a couple people that have come in and have bought them. I'll put money down that they will not be long-term rent, or they'll be short-term rentals in a year from now, because of the amount of work that it takes to actually maintain a single standing unit, especially a house. It does not come cheap to do that. There is some really great success, and it gives the property owner the ability to come in and out of their house and check their house in a way that they're not able to do with long-term rental. But again, I say this, it's just surprising that you are discriminating against a group of housing because of a fear of what it may do to the neighborhood, when really it's quite a small percentage of the overall population of homes. And according to Airbnb, not the problem. So I just wanted to be sure that you all know that. I truly believe, and I will put something in writing, that we need our buildings and our properties the room to breathe, and that means flexibility. I'm right across from a beautiful old building that used to be a grocery store. It's now 4 units, and that's great. So what I just want to say is, remember, there's a flexibility in Burlington properties coming and going in terms of what their usage is. The whole idea is to make sure that they stay and maintain as residents, whether it's long-term, short-term, or owner occupied. Thank you again for the time. Sorry to keep you up.
Thank you.
Okay. One more hand was just raised,
Okay.
Andy. Chris Hasley.
Hey, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but my understanding is that this discussion was largely driven by the need to preserve the affordable housing. And the question I have is, affordable for whom? And I wanted to zone in a little bit on some of the comments that Councilor Mason had about the number of single family homes in his neighborhood that had been converted into short-term rentals. And I asked this committee, how is that any different than somebody coming in and taking an entire unit, entire single family home, and turning it into student housing? We have entire neighborhoods in this city, Buell Street, Bradley Street, South Union, Isham, Green, Loomis, that at one time were very clearly neighborhoods for families. And now they're not. They're kind of an off-campus extension of the University of Vermont. And, you know, how is that any different? And I'm 47 years old, I'm married, I have a kid, and I'm still renting. And the reason that I'm still renting is because I can't afford to buy a home in Burlington. I'd love to stay in Burlington. Burlington is my home. I have to go looking outside of Burlington and like Underhill and Jericho, where I can maybe find something that's in the realm of affordability. My wife's a public school teacher. In addition to this, I walk around the downtown area where I live, And I see numerous buildings that were very clearly built as single-family homes that have since been converted into doctors' offices, lawyers' offices, dentists' offices, mixed-use retail, restaurants. I think that this is an issue. It's a very small slice of the bigger issue here. And what I would really like to see this committee do is focus on the larger issue of affordability. And I think that the issue goes back, more than the 20 years that I've been in town. It goes back more than 30. It goes back to 40. And as I understand it, there was a really big push in the early 80s for infill development and the idea that, well, if we allow these houses to be converted into rentals, we will increase the supply and make it easier for ordinary Vermonters, as Mayor Clavel would like to used to say, to get housing and keep it affordable. And while that was a good idea, people realized really quick that, well, heck, if I rent them out to college students, I can make a lot more money. That's the same thing as what's going on with some of these STRs right now. And I'm a renter and I'm an Airbnb host. I'd like to be able to have that, but under the proposals that you guys are, floating nowadays, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to have that ability. And so I would ask that, we take a bigger step up to the 10,000 foot view perhaps, and take a bigger look at some of these issues. And respectfully with the issue with some of the student housing, which is largely driven, I think, by UVM and to a lesser extent Champlain, but these are nonprofits. Every time we allow a nonprofit to take a unit off the tax rolls, we're increasing the burden on ordinary taxpayers here who are trying to stay in Burlington in an environment that is, becoming less and less affordable. And again, I'm a renter. I don't own property, but I understand what's going on for some of the folks here. And I would like to see us move in a direction where we can address that. And maybe the next time, UVM comes up and the pilot agreement is up, maybe we try to hold them to account. And if I remember correctly, the last time I looked into that, it's basically paying pennies on the dollar for their properties. We've got properties up in the campus section that are being turned into departmental offices for the university. So maybe, from my view, maybe what we need to do is disincentivize the conversion of single-family homes into anything but other than single-family homes. I don't have the solution, but I think it's a conversation worth having. And while I do recognize that there are certainly some bad actors here in the Airbnb host community who are doing exactly what everyone's wanting to prevent, which is turning entire units into de facto rooming houses, I think this is very much a multifaceted problem that deserves a multifaceted solution. And while certainly looking at STRs is one part of it, there's a lot of other moving parts and components that I really would like to see this organization take a look at. So closing, I just say thank you for your time and thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts.
Great, thanks. Megan, is that it for now?
That's all I
Great.
see
And
for
so
now.
again, we'll have an opportunity for people to speak at our next meeting as well, for anyone who missed tonight. So thank you. I'll close the public forum on short-term rentals. Item 5 is commissioner items. Our next meeting, is it still scheduled for January 26th and February 9th? Okay.
Yeah, those are our next two meetings. I know the fourth Tuesday of the month usually doesn't work for Counselor Hansen for these joint committee meetings. So I just wanted to check in on the counselor's availability for the February 9th meeting, or if possible, the 26th meeting.
Yeah, I do have the Transportation, Energy, and Utilities committee on that fourth Tuesday, so the 26th. The alternative was the 9th, you said?
February 9th would be the next meeting.
Yeah, I'm open on February 9th.
Okay, and 6:45 again, since it's a Tuesday. Is that right, Counselor
I'm
Matera?
free, so that'll be ended for me.
Oh,
So
okay. So then I think, Andy, what I'm hearing is that the Planning Commission's next meeting will be January 26th at 6:30. The next joint committee meeting will be February 9th at 6:30.
Great, thank you. Any other commissioner items?
Yeah, just quickly, I did attend the Conservation Board's meeting on nature-based climate solutions, and they're starting a planning process with a consultant. They're in the very early stages, so I'll continue to monitor that and ask for an input when they get to that stage.
Okay, great, thanks. Anyone else? Okay, we'll close that item. And item 6 is minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept communications?
So moved.
And a motion by Alex, seconded by Eves, I think. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, then item 7 is adjournment. Motion to adjourn by Jennifer, seconded by Harris. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
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 We stand adjourned. Thank you. It was a long meeting, but I think we got a lot.